Hey there, we'll start the Cloudcast in just a second. But if you're listening to this podcast, you already know that the IT transformations we're going through today depend on a lot more than just the raw technology itself. I'm John Mark Troyer, and I am organizing The Reckoning, a conference in Half Moon Bay, California on September 13th and 14th. At The Reckoning, we'll talk about how technologists can take charge of their careers, communicate more effectively, and create a future IT that does not suck. Invest in yourself and come join us at this community event. Listeners of the Cloudcast can get $100 off by using the code Cloudcast. Go to signup.techreckoning.com to register. Now here's Brian and Aaron from the Massive Studios with another exciting episode of the Cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the Massive Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another episode of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from Mesoscon here in Seattle. Again, first off, a huge thank you to the Lanx Foundation once again for having us as a media sponsor for the event. Got a great guest today. Wanted to really... He has his own podcast, first of all. but
The Data Center Show.
Yes, exactly. But wanted to talk to Derrick Harris. I believe the title is Senior Research Analyst, correct, at Mesosphere?
Yes.
Okay. And so first of all, let's kind of go back a little bit. Did some excellent work at GigaOm. And without kind of, like we were saying earlier, opening up the scabs and pouring salt in the wounds. How did you end up at Mesosphere, and what are you kind of working on these days as doing research there?
Well, so how did I end up at Mesosphere? If you were a GigaOm reader, you probably recall that the GigaOm had an unceremonious demise earlier this year. So I was unemployed, and it was so yes, I was unemployed. I started getting job offers were coming in, and Mesosphere. I always pronounce it wrong. I'm going to call it Mesosphere. Mesosphere was. I know how to say Mesos, but the whole word.
Nick, you have to vote here. What's your vote? Is it Mesos?
I like Mesos.
Okay.
Yeah, me too. But when I say the whole thing, I want to say Mesosphere for some reason. But we're going to go Mesosphere.
Right.
So Florian, the CEO of Mesosphere, reached out and said, "Hey, you should come work for us." And I'd always thought, "Hey, what's it like to go work for a startup? Is that something I'd like to do?" I'd been in journalism for so long, so I jumped on it. And I gave it a go. So that's how I ended up here.
Cool.
And what do I do, you asked?
Yeah.
Well, so the title Research Analyst is funny.
Okay. Did you get to pick it, first of all?
It was suggested. What happened was I said, I don't want the word... this is the old, the journalist part of me. I don't want the word content in my title at all because that's a dirty word.
Fair enough.
But I don't do a lot of research, as it turns out. I am helping out with analyst relations. I've been on the client side of the Gartner relationship now, which is an interesting experience if you've never done that.
I have actually, not for my present day job, but one of my other day jobs. Yes, completely agree. Interesting is a good way to put it.
Should we have another podcast just about that?
No, that's multiple beers and no recording for that particular conversation.
I will say that I've enjoyed working with them so far. They're very very accommodating, but that's a small part of my job, and the majority of it I write a lot of blog posts for a blog. I help out with some ideas around product messaging and launch and strategy. I run this other publication called Scale, which I have the company blessing to do. So
yeah, and we were actually going to talk about that. So Scale is really focused on kind of large-scale data centers and data analytics, and so let's actually talk about that. So what kind of trends or new ideas are really interesting to you in that space right now?
Well, without going too Mesos-y, even though we're here at Mesoscon, I think Mesos was something I was tracking before joining the company, and just the whole idea of when cloud computing first came into vogue about a decade ago, a little less than that, right? There was a lot of... It seemed like the early adopters And a lot of the early use cases were like, we're just going to take this application that we built, this web app, and we're going to port it onto Amazon, and now we're using cloud computing. But when I first started thinking about cloud computing, I think about it in the architecture diagram sort of way. So to me, it wasn't like the cloud was necessarily where the servers were located. It was what the servers looked like. Right, so I always looked at no one talked about containers really back then, but my vision of cloud computing was always, at least early on, was, well, this should play out like how Google runs or like how Facebook runs, right? Where you kind of have, these various terms have been floated around throughout. I remember what people were calling like application virtualization or something, but it's essentially this idea of pool of resources. How can you automate scheduling, that sort of thing. So that's always been one of my visions, I guess, for how I thought the cloud was going to play out. Like you actually operate like a data center, like an internet company or a cloud provider, if you will, and not just consume resources from them. So I thought, that's something that's really interesting. And obviously there's, the data space just keeps maturing.
Yep.
And I think that's been, when you look at data center trends, like, people are designing for, these new types of workloads, which more and more include, Hadoop or some sort of de facto thing in there, right? And I think that's a trend that keeps going on. And then there's the container trend overall. That's clearly,
sure.
Unless you've been under a rock for the past 2 years, you've been paying attention to that. So there's a lot of interesting things. Deep learning, which is I covered a lot of AI and deep learning at GigaOm, and that's the thing. I won't call it a huge data center trend, but when you start thinking about how you're going to, the new types of things, the new types of applications, the new types of data analysis you want to do at some point, I think that's going to be a big trend. Like how do we design a data center to account for the fact that we might want this big GPU farm, right? Or we want to run these new algorithms.
It's definitely a new emerging workload, which is going to,
it
becomes almost a component of a lot of the new applications. Like your next application is intelligent or better than your competitor because you've used deep learning correctly.
Right, and so but right now architecturally, it requires a different setup. If you're going to do that in-house, it requires a different way
It's
of
not.
thinking.
It's definitely not a distributed thing yet by any means. It's very much of a big GPU assigned schedule thing. But the frameworks are really getting to a point now where it's getting more accessible though. So people are trying to figure out what they really want to do with it.
Yeah, but I think that it's one of those applications going forward. I think that's going to make people think about. They're going to design for that as a de facto or default use case.
So between machine learning and big data, we're going to have Skynet.
Well, deep learning.
Yeah, deep. So and that's pretty much what the Intel Developers Forum was for earlier this week, right, Nick?
Yeah, but I'm just kidding. you did see our giant robots, right?
I did.
They do run off deep learning.
Yeah, that's.
Don't get me started on that. I'm not a big doom and gloom.
It's actually funny because at Mesosphere, Christos, if anybody's listening to this podcast, you can corner Christos and ask him what deep learning is. He'll get really excited and let you know that deep learning is just dense matrix multiplication. It's not magic. And he'll walk you through like the mathematics. Like this has been around for a while. It's just getting better. It's really funny because he definitely doesn't buy into the whole AI taking over the world thing.
Well, when you talk to anyone who's, you talk to like the Jan LeCuns and the Andrew Wings of the world, they're pretty. And this is their career, so they're I would say inclined to boast about the capabilities, but. The reality, it's so far. When you read, if you read this book, Superintelligence, which I panned at one point and got, killed in the comments. But I was it's such a big leap to go from where we are today to,
It's a huge leap from that looks like a beach in that picture to, I'm going to send you to the beach.
Well, yeah, right? And it's not just, to me, it's not just the, can it recognize a pattern? Can it recognize something? Even if you had a cognizant, I don't know, some sort of cognizant, or what's the word I'm looking for? Is cognizant the word?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. But it's the idea that if just because we had a machine, it would have the same. People are always like, you can't tell what a machine. You can't presume to know what a machine would think or that it would be human-like. But then they put these human-like aspirations to the machine. Like the machine would want to take over. The machine wouldn't want to be boxed up. The machine, so essentially, it does think like a human.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe it would just want to do its job. That would be
right.
Yeah. We can't make it do that quite perfectly yet, anyways.
No.
The one thing it can't do is its job. Everything else is going to run amok.
Yeah, completely. So, and like I was saying earlier, flip part of that is big data, right? So it's another area you've covered for a good while. And the problem I kind of always saw in that space was data science skills and being really difficult to find data science skills. And so what's kind of an update there? And are you seeing anything that's kind of making it easier for companies to really engage in big data kind of activities and the technology, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I think data science, I mean, as a term, I don't think I hear the word data scientist thrown about as much. I think either all of them that have ever going to be hired have been hired, or they're just changing the names of it.
It was around for a while, though. There was a period where they had conferences. It was data scientist conference.
Well, yeah, and I mean, Cloudera is actually putting on one, I think, coming up soon. That's billed as a data science conference. I mean, it's still a viable thing. So to get to your point, or your question, I think that as I watch that space kind of as more of an outsider now, the one thing I've noticed is I think the tools have caught on, right? So I think people have come to some idea of we've got past what is a data scientist, what is data science, and we've gotten down to here are the tools of the job, and people are starting to learn them and work with them. And yeah, I mean, things are definitely getting easier. I think so. Cloudera, not to talk of Cloudera too much, but they bought this company, the name of DataPad, was that the company? The name which escapes me, but it's from the guys who built some of the Python libraries for.
So disclaimer: I do work for Intel, so I'm somewhat related to the Cloudera stuff.
So yeah, just minorly. So I think but to me, when I started seeing Cloudera go on this path of first when it bought the company and then it starts to put on this conference, it's saying to me like the big companies are coming around now, and they're selling this access to these tools, and Microsoft buying our. I mean, what Microsoft's been doing with Azure machine learning and some of these things. I mean, these things are becoming productized. I think at a much higher level. Did
you see the announcement? And not to pimp Intel cool stuff, but the announcement about the analytics toolkit. Like Intel did all this work in open source to say, let's reduce the friction between an analyst or somebody wants to like look at data or algorithms and just orchestrate, make them connect to each other, right? And not that that's a pattern just for big data, but I see it a lot where you have these experts, right, that want to use computing, but they have a discipline that's different than computing, right? Like the data scientists. But I'd like to use the computing to do what I want to do. And then the tools, like you mentioned, the tools are getting to a point where they're being written for those people, but they work on a cloud and scale, right? Like you could write a framework for Mesos that could be specifically for one vertical discipline and make that tool extremely easy for them to use in their day use. And I see a lot of that being repeated, not just in data science, but in other areas, right?
Yeah. And I mean, obviously there are people working, within large web companies, especially on the cutting edge of building new tools. But when you look at the toolkit, I mean, Kafka, Hadoop, Spark, there are well-funded companies around all these things. There are products around all these things now. They're not just these closet open source projects anymore. And so Mesosphere announced this morning, we announced this thing called Infinity, which is a forthcoming product, but it's like a one command install of Spark, Cassandra, Akka, and Kafka. And so, I mean, 2 years ago, if you had said, I need to install this big data system, it would have been like, in 2 years, maybe we'll have it installed.
The first thing is how many people do I have to hire, and what are the diversity of the skills I have to have in shop to just do that?
Yeah, and so it's the obstacles and I guess the friction points are becoming reduced so greatly that it's kind of shocking. I mean, I talked to an analyst off the record, whatever you're going to say, just in a casual conversation recently, and I was asking him about what they're seeing. He's like, now that companies our clients are starting to realize they need Hadoop or they need big data, they're starting to ask they're getting down to the real question of how do I deploy it,
right?
Yeah. which is the point. It's getting a lot easier, so the tools are really moving fast.
Yep. So let's get back to Mesos and Mesosphere real quick. Question about use cases. Is this a technology where we will see lots of customers using this and a large number of customers, but maybe smaller size workloads or smaller installations? Or is this smaller numbers of customers, but really, really large usage models. Like, where do you think it's going to fall ultimately?
I honestly, I think it's going to be both.
Okay.
And not to hedge or dodge the question, but so, it's funny when I first started talking with Flo and some of the guys in Mesosphere a few years ago, it was always, this is what runs Twitter. Twitter's running this on tens of thousands of cores. And that was the hook. That was the exciting thing. It's built, it's based on like how Google Borg is and all. And so that gets people in. And then don't get me wrong, Twitter and Apple and some of these, you notice all the Apple people around here. Like, Apple is a legit user and it's a big operation, but those are the flagship users. But the one thing I've been seeing is talking to like especially early Mesos adopters, Yelp, Groupon, some startups, a lot of startups even. They're not running it at any kind of scale like that. They're running, they're doing it. And the other thing is, like, you think use cases might be one company is running it on like a dozen nodes or something. Autodesk is using it on a few clusters of a dozen nodes or so a piece. Because one thing.
That's a really important point though, because I've been in a lot of architectural discussions. In Intel I have to I get to the honor of being around because it really is an honor, right? HPC people have been around for 30 years who deal with these massive clusters, and then you go talk with an enterprise the next day who only has 100 servers. And a lot of times that technology that's been around, which is like the Mesos-like stuff, this big super scale, has never been used before because it never could downscale.
Yeah.
And the ability for something to downscale for the common man instead of the university is actually a pretty huge feature in itself.
Well, yeah, and the one thing you're seeing is, too, so I came in and I'm thinking, so what are the use cases of Mesos, right? Well, it's going to be, you're running massive web operations. It's going to be these big data pipelines. It's going to be all these things. But a very popular one, it turns out, is just continuous integration, continuous delivery, and how can we automate, make it so easy for our developers to deploy an app in a Docker container and be done.
Well, it's all set up, right? We had the dream of DevOps, the process, DevOps tooling, the books, and all this stuff. And now that we all want it really, really badly, we have to have tools that'll actually deliver that.
Yeah. So it's just funny. It's so not the big. The big scale out sort of crazy use case people might think of. It's literally like, how easy can we make it to configure and deploy applications?
A lot of people forget that the virtualization, in the early days of virtualization, it was development. Yeah. Like VMware made their first big round of money on helping development shops because it was easy to fire VMs up for the two different developers, right? Yeah. And development is usually a great first pain point for a lot of customers because operational cost is huge.
Yeah, that being said, Mesosphere already has, some large and unnamed customers, and there are
named customers
and named ones. There are definitely those use cases out there, and I think smaller shops obviously will grow the technology. Already I've spoken with some, and they're like, well, listen, here's what we're starting with, and it's really useful. We've got our utilization of our Amazon instances up to 80% on average. That's pretty good when they're down to like 14 or something. But then they say, but now we're looking at deploying Spark. Right now we want to try this, and if it's just as easy as install and get started, I think it makes it it's just so much easier to experiment and try to grow. So.
People will reuse the utility if it works in one scenario, it might work in another one.
Yeah, I thought some of the talks today at the conference were really eye-opening. 2 Sigma gave a great one about the hedge fund about how it preempts jobs and how it does this kind of fair scheduling. No,
it was really good. I was in that one. And another interesting thing about that was the tie-in. I saw that to the reclamation talk that Ben did earlier. When he was talking about how some of the features in Mesos they want to push for is some of that being native. And so then you get 2 Sigma talks a little later about how useful that was and the way they prioritize their workloads and the way they're able to like sort and give fairness and high utilization at the same time. It's really kind of cool to see those two things, right? One after another.
And then Netflix gave a talk around when Netflix open sourced its scheduler today and talked about some of the same, not quite as advanced as 2 Sigma, but some of the same things. But it gets to the point of, so you want to experiment with this new Spark cluster. Now, maybe you have a dev cluster over there. Maybe this isn't on the production cluster. But the idea that you could get to the point where you go, okay, I'm going to spin up the Spark cluster, and it's not going to it's not going to wreck your job, right? Maybe this job won't run for 14 hours until there's space. But like the limitations and the barriers being removed is really powerful.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Switch gears one more time. Sometimes we kind of wonder about revenue models for companies that are based on open source projects. What was kind of your level of understanding all of this when you were an independent analyst, and do you view it differently now that you're kind of on the evil vendor side, right? What's your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I mean, my thought always was that, for the past several years at least, it was pretty clear that if you don't have an open source component starting off as a new company, even as an existing company, you're kind of, I mean, if you look at every large vendor out there right now has an open source, and large and growing open source contingent. And so
we've said on the show previously, we firmly believe that I think VMware was the last big old style company.
But yeah, and you can see it going open source in a hurry too.
Right. But besides hardware companies, though, right?
Right. So, I mean, that's just the way it is.
But so and to actually answer your question, so it's important. You have to do it. Now, I will say this, being like the Mesosphere model, which you might call equivalent to the Cloudera model, you might call it equivalent to a lot of other companies, is open source core, open source free, open source community edition, but then you have an actual product, right, that you go out there and you sell. That's an enterprise product. It has the added features. It has, you'll go in and install it on premises, for example. You'll go and really go the extra mile. You'll support it. So, I mean, so that's one model, and I think that's working well. I think companies who do that are earning money. They're earning revenue, and the questionable, I won't say questionable, but the one that still to me hasn't panned out, is the entirely open source, just like aside from Red Hat. Mm-hmm. But even Red Hat isn't, I mean, if Red Hat sold software, I mean, it might be a much larger company than it is right now, right? I mean, I think that, so the Hortonworks of the world, the MongoDB, Mongo has some enterprise stuff, but you see these products that are so widely used. And you just wonder, the complaint you always hear is that the free version is good enough. I don't need to use the paid version. Right. I don't want to pay for the one feature that's in that might be in an enterprise version. It's just, it's tricky to me. I guess I don't know that the time will tell there's so many companies that are just doing open source, and then maybe there's an enterprise edition, maybe there's not. Can you rely on support? Didn't really be a huge company. I don't know. I
always have an interesting perspective on that because, and this comes from kind of like some of the strategy on our side in Cloud at Intel, and that we look at things like Jevons paradox, where it's the economic paradox where the easier something is to consume. This is done by the guy that did this. Jevons did this research back in coal mining days. The easier something is to consume, you actually increase the demand for it. So a lot of times I look at this thing where open source companies and support, and it seems like the revenue would be less, but if you actually make something easier to consume and everybody starts doing it more, you actually increase the demand for it. So I wonder if we really have like solid community backing and things get really democratized out, where things that Google's been doing for years become really easy for everybody else. If we don't just grow that market way larger than we ever thought it could be, ultimately. And so ultimately you end up making maybe even more money is doing support and doing curated stuff and helping people deliver it, where instead of owning the whole thing and having completely proprietary.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, a bigger pot is certainly, I mean, if you look at what Google is doing with Kubernetes, for example, they want to make money off it at the end of the day, right? And part of it is growing a big community of users around it and making it easy to get started with. But I think the one thing that's tricky, to me at least, is like, if everything is open source to begin with, you don't, what am I trying to say? There's not always the necessity to go pay someone to support you, right? So you run that risk. You certainly run that risk. The other thing is, from a company perspective, if you don't come out and build like a solidly differentiated product around it, you run the risk of, the open source project is the thing. Like you don't need to.
Well, even like think about like customers. I mean, most enterprises, and I'm going to speak like enterprise, and I'm going to leave off the big, large Twitters and the Airbnbs. I'm take them off the list. But going down a little smaller in scale, there's a lot of companies that still have their main top of line business has nothing to do with technology purely, right? It uses it. But for them, technology is a cost factor, but it's also a bet. And so for them, support's very critical because they have to have some kind of indication where, like, if something goes wrong, I pay these people to cover my butt, right? So there's always going to be that model in place. But then outside of that, if the Disney and GE are both enabling that same open source solution and they're each benefiting, it's like that cooperative thing is now involved much more than it used to be, right? Where before it was like, I will buy VMware and you'll buy VMware. We don't even talk to each other, right?
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, it's such a different. I mean, I don't envy companies trying to. I guess the companies who start with this as the baseline have probably an easier time adopting. But yeah,
right.
there's just so. Look at this conference. I mean, look at the companies that are here. Look at the companies that are everywhere at DockerCon talking
right.
about how they're using this stuff, and you start to wonder, like, there's certainly money to be made. And
right.
But if you're used to selling to those companies, and then they're like, well, I was at this conference and I was learning about whatever, right? Or I've been talking to the startup that's doing something, and they built the product. They know the code from the ground up. Like,
sure.
there are all these.
The thing is, I mean, like Airbnb. I mean, you think about staying in hotels. Its brand is just as strong now, almost as like Marriott in a lot of ways, right? And it's interesting how
they probably valued it more too.
But probably, well, good example is Amazon's worth more than Walmart, right?
Yeah.
And so at a certain point, the leadership of those companies have got to start looking at the technology patterns these people are adopting and saying, maybe this is the way to differentiate the business model, top of line apps that I run. And I think it's going to bleed over in these bigger ones as well. It's just, I've always said, and again, the previous podcast we talked about, like, what is the path to it? Like, what is the transition from? I finally got used to VMs. I used to do physical servers, and now I've got to go back to physical servers, but with containers on it. How does that look?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's just a lot of questions about, how you sell it, how you package it. Those are important. And then, from a company, do you cater to developers? Do you cater to CIOs? Do you build this big? I mean, Amazon Web Services came up building this huge base of, bottom up adoption.
Yeah.
But then when you're running a company, you go, well, we're going to put my eggs. I have a limited number of resources here. Like, who am I going? I can't. You're not going to write it off like Amazon did for so long. So there are a lot of. I mean, listen. I guess the short answer is I don't know.
Fair enough. All right. So I tell you what, we're out of time for this week. Derrick, where can everyone find out more about you and what you have going on?
Well, they can check out the Scale blog. They can listen to the Data Center Show podcast. When they're done with Cloudcast, you can go to iTunes or SoundCloud and listen.
Or listen to both at the same time.
Yeah, simultaneous stereo. And then you can on Twitter too at Derrick Harris.
Awesome. Nick, I didn't give you a chance on the last show. Anything you want to plug?
I like computers.
So I don't think you can plug anything anymore.
And we love everybody.
There you go.
Intel
loves everybody. There you go. There's your thought for the day.
We want to make everybody's computing power better.
There you go. All right.
That's a terrible marketing thing, by the way. I don't know why I said that.
Yeah,
we're just as catchy as Intel inside.
Yeah.
We're cutting you off right now. All right, that's it. All right, thank you everybody for your time today, and thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.